Did you know that the first HBCU might have been right here in New Haven? This is some of the story of the proposal for a Black college in New Haven in 1831. Let me set the scene with a brief overview of New Haven at the time, and then turn to why this proposal happened in 1831, why organizers wanted to build a college, why New Haven was the proposed site, and why it didn't happen. As I do this, I hope that you will consider with me what could have been, and also consider what we remember, the stories we remember, and the stories we choose to forget. First, a bit about New Haven and Connecticut and Yale in 1831. The Industrial Revolution was underway, signs of prosperity were abundant. Steamboat service between New York and New Haven had begun in 1815, and the Farmington Canal opened in 1825. New Haven was then co-capital of Connecticut, as it would remain until 1875. And in fact, the impressive new State House had just opened on the New Haven Green across from Yale near College Street, just behind the Center Church. James A. Hill House had opened his new mansion, Sachem's Wood, at the top of Hill House Avenue in 1830, one of a number of substantial new homes built by elite white business and civic leaders around 1831. New Haven, to them, would have been a city on the rise. New Haven was a center of learning and scholarship and publishing. Noah Webster completed his epic American Dictionary of the English Language here, and it was printed in 1828 by his fellow New Havener, Hezekiah Howe. Connecticut in this time had the highest college matriculation rate in the nation and the nation's highest literacy rate. In 1830, New Haven's population was 10,678. That may not seem large, but at the time, New Haven was the nation's 23rd largest city. Like most cities, it was quite compact. In that population, there were 10,108 white people, 566 free Black people, and 4 enslaved people in 1830. Yes, slavery was still legal in Connecticut, if not widespread. Though gradual emancipation had begun in Connecticut in 1784, slavery was not completely abolished until 1848, the last state in New England to abolish slavery. And in fact, the 1818 Connecticut Constitution had prohibited Black people from voting. Black men in Connecticut did not get the franchise until 1870 with the 15th Amendment to the US Constitution. Most of the white people in 1830 were of English descent, like the first settler colonialists. Most would have been Congregationalists, though the Episcopal Church, founded in 1753, was by that time well established, and there was a Methodist church and a Baptist church. Black people began organizing their own congregations, both Congregational and Methodist, by 1818, leaving segregated predominantly white churches to create their own free spaces for worship. Immigration was just beginning to bring new residents from Europe, and that would be seen in years and decades ahead in religious organizing with the establishment of the Catholic Church in 1834 and a Jewish synagogue in 1840. In 1830, Yale had a total of 469 students enrolled, 331 students in Yale College, the rest studying medicine, law, and divinity. And again, that doesn't seem large by today's standards, but by the 1830s, Yale was the largest college in the country. That year, 81 students earned bachelor's degrees, 46 master's degrees, and 22 doctors of medicines. Half of the students were from Connecticut. About 10% were from southern states. The entire campus comprised mostly what we know as the old campus now, just west of the central New Haven Green. All of the Yale students were male and of European descent, and virtually all would have been Protestant. Educationally, Yale was a national leader. The Yale Report of 1828 got much attention and was a major document in establishing the liberal arts curriculum in the nation. So that's a little bit about New Haven and Connecticut and Yale in 1831. For the purposes of today's story, why 1831 for the proposal for a Black college? Well, 1831 was the dawn of the abolition movement. The previous year, in September 1830, Black leaders from throughout the antebellum North gathered at Mother Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia. Dr. P. Gabriel Foreman and Sarah Patterson, in an exquisite online exhibition, called that convention, quote, the meeting that launched a movement, the abolition movement, the movement for Black freedom. I want to take a moment to celebrate the extraordinary work of Dr. Foreman and her colleagues in the Colored Conventions Project, a scholarly and community research project dedicated to bringing the 7 decades-long history of 19th century Black organizing to digital life. If you do not know the CCP, you should. You can find them online at coloredconventionsoneword.org. Bishop Richard Allen gave the address at his church for that 1830 meeting, and the delegates included Scipio Augustus of New Haven. This Black freedom movement had some white allies, including Simeon Jocelyn in New Haven, William Lloyd Garrison, who had begun publishing The Liberator. New Haven Black leaders John Creed and J.L. Cross would become agents for The Liberator in 1831. So that's a bit of the context. It's the dawn of the abolition movement, but why a college? Why New Haven? Let's travel back to June of 1831 and take up the events from there. A key figure is Simeon Jocelyn. And these are some earlier documents in the papers of Bias Stanley, an extraordinary free Black leader in New Haven. Here you see an agreement between the African Ecclesiastical Society, the New Black Church, Congregational Church, and Simeon Jocelyn, signed by Bias Stanley and other New Haven Black leaders, William Lanson, Prince Cooper, Prince Duplex, Scipio Augustus. And then this is the Constitution of become what we now know as the Dixwell Avenue United Church of Christ, the oldest Black congregational church in the nation, dating back to 1818. So this is a context of freedom in New Haven, people organizing the Black church, calling Simeon Jocelyn, a white pastor and abolitionist, to lead that congregation. Jocelyn, in May 28th, 1831, writes to William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist in Boston, and Jocelyn tells him of, and this is from a letter in the Boston Public Library, of an institution of learning to educate colored young men, a college. Jocelyn states that Arthur Tappan, the New York philanthropist and abolitionist who also had a home in New Haven, he said that Tappan supports the plan and had already committed $1,000, that a site had been chosen in New Haven. He talked about what the college would do. He told Garrison that he, Jocelyn, had been down to meet with the Reverend Peter Williams, a Black leader in New York, to speak about mutual interest in education, and that they had decided to merge their schools for this new college. And Garrison was asked by Jocelyn to accompany him and Arthur Tappan to present the plan, quote, at the convention of the people of color who meet the week after next in Philadelphia, i.e. in beginning of June. And sure enough, Jocelyn, Tappan, Garrison go to the convention in Philadelphia, the Wesley Church, what's known as the first annual convention. And again, you can find in the coloredconventions.org all of these documents. This is a first edition of the proceedings of that 1831 convention. They talk about the college, present it to the free people there, the leadership of the Black community in the antebellum North, and they come to agreement about the college. In the discussion, let me read from these minutes and proceedings of the first annual convention of why New Haven, and I will quote directly from the minutes. First, the site is healthy and beautiful. Second, its inhabitants are friendly, pious, generous, and humane. Third, its laws are salutary and protecting to all without regard to complexion. Fourth, boarding is cheap and provisions are good. Fifth, the situation is as central as any other that can be obtained with the same advantages. A sixth reason is given, and that is that New Haven carries on an extensive West Indian trade. And folks knew that with abolition of the slave trade and freedom in the West Indies, that this would, and again quoting, quote, many of the wealthy colored residents in the islands would no doubt send their sons there to this new college to be educated, and thus a fresh tie of friendship would be formed, which might be productive of much real good in the end. And then finally, at the convention, they note this reason for the college being in New Haven, quote, and last, though not least, the literary and scientific character of New Haven renders it a very desirable place for the location of the college. One of the things that's talked about that I wanted to highlight, and this is again quoting from the convention minutes, quote, the convention would wish it to be distinctly understood that the trustees of the contemplated institution shall, a majority of them, be colored persons. The number is proposed 7, 3 white and 4 colored. Note that out of this convention, plans of the college were for Black leadership, 4 Black trustees, 3 white trustees. And this is why James Brewer Stewart, writing in 2003, noted that, quote, the alliance struck in 1831 between Black and white activists on behalf of the New Haven Negro College marked a truly revolutionary turn in the history of race relations in the United States. And he called it, Stewart called it, quote, the most visionary interracial project yet attempted in the nation's history. So the convention is held June 6th to 11th. Tappan, Garrison, and Jocelyn are speaking on June 8th. The convention agrees. They go off. They set up an organizing committee. Reverend Samuel Cornish is a lead agent, lots of other leaders in this. Garrison goes out on the road, talks about various things, including the college. This is a printed copy of addresses that he gave in June 1831 to audiences in Philadelphia and New York. He was actually in New Haven and spoke in New Haven on June 22nd and 24th at the Third Church in New Haven on Chapel Street at Union Street. And the college is being talked about. It's noticed in the Liberator, the abolitionist paper out of Boston, a number of times in July. And on July 30th, 1831, there's this notice in the New York papers in the New York Evangelist. Quote, it is proposed by respectable Negro men and philanthropic writers to establish a Negro college at New Haven. Arthur Tappan, Esquire, has proposed to raise among the whites $10,000, provided a like sum is raised by the blacks. Reverend Samuel E. Cornish has been duly appointed to receive subscriptions. The paper says, the idea is a good one. We wish success to the undertaking with all our heart. And again, it's important to note that the free people said that they knew and that they wanted and they would raise funds for this. So this was a cooperative endeavor with 4 Black trustees, 3 white trustees, and equal portions of fundraising. It was not the only fundraising effort happening around New Haven at the time. And that brings us to September and a fateful week or two in the history of New Haven and of this proposal for a Black college. September 1st, 1831, this is the terms of subscription, as you can see, dated September 1st, 1831, for what came to be known as the Kentum Millia Fund, which was the first formal Yale fundraising campaign. It's dated September 1st, 1831, because not long afterwards, on September 13th, the alumni would be meeting in New Haven. At that time, commencement and reunions happened in September, not in May or June, as we've come to know them in more recent decades. So September 1st, Kentum Millia Fund. September 5th, a notice is published in the Philadelphia Chronicle from the Provisional Committee in Philadelphia of the Negro College. So again, it's being talked about in various places. And on September 7th, Simeon Jocelyn gives an address on Wednesday, September 7th, to the Third Church in New Haven. Jocelyn, a notice says, will speak on, quote, the subject of the moral, intellectual, and civil improvement of the people of color in the United States. So Jocelyn speaks on Wednesday, September 7th. surely about the college plans, and no doubt also about abolition and anti-slavery efforts more generally. Wednesday, September 7th. It's noticed on September 6th. It's also on September 6th, 1831, that the first notice appears in a New Haven newspaper of the insurrection in Virginia, what we know as Nat Turner's Rebellion. The paper says, quote, "The insurrection in Virginia appears to have been very easily suppressed." Goes on for a few more sentences about Nat Turner's Rebellion in Southampton. So that's happening around the same time, and many scholars note that it surely had some impact in the conversations in town and in the discussions around the college. Wednesday, September 7th, Jocelyn addresses the Third Society. The next day, on Thursday, September 8th, Dennis Kimberly, the mayor of New Haven, makes a notice calling for a meeting of the freedmen, i.e. the white property owners, 2 days later on Saturday, September 10th. So this is the New Haven Daily Advertiser. Sorry, the New Haven Advertiser, it was a weekly paper. And this is the notice here by the mayor, Mayor Kimberly, who happened to be a graduate of Yale. And you see that it's calling for a meeting 2 days hence. It was published on September 9th in this newspaper. You also see, again, a notice just underneath it, coincident, of the preliminary meeting of the alumni of Yale College that would happen a few days after the town meeting on Tuesday, September 13th. Commencement that year was on September 14th. Jocelyn gives a talk on Wednesday, September 7th. The next day, the mayor calls a town meeting about the proposed Black College to be held 2 days later on Saturday, September 10th at the town hall. The town hall was a space in the State House, the co-capitol building that had just opened in 1831, the new State House on the green. And this is an image here. You see the Center Church of New Haven, and then you see here behind the trees the imposing and wonderful new edifice that everyone celebrated in 1831, and Yale College behind it. That gives you a sense, again, of how compact. Jocelyn speaks on September 7th, town meeting on Saturday, September 10th. Commencement would be on Wednesday, September 14th. Commencement happened here in the Center Church. Everything is very close together in New Haven. So the town meeting's held on Saturday, September 10th. And I'm quoting from one of many, many newspaper reports about it. Quote, "So great was the interest to hear the discussion that notwithstanding the excessive heat and the almost irrespirable atmosphere of the room, the hall was crowded throughout the afternoon. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people packed, men, white men, packed into the State House, to the town hall, a space of just under 3,000 square feet on a hot Saturday afternoon. Imagine the scene. Remember that the organizers had proposed New Haven as the home because it was full of pious, generous, hospitable, and humane people. The town meeting answered those claims by a vote of 700 to 4 against the college. An extraordinary turn, a near unanimous decision. Only 4 people spoke up in favor of the proposal. Again, a few days later, the town would celebrate a college with Yale commencement on September 13th. So we've gone from June and the convention in Philadelphia, just a few months later, to early September and the town meeting voting against the proposal for the Black College in New Haven. I wanted to talk a little bit and review what happened at that town meeting, why, what the reactions were, And much of what we have come to know about that time is because of this pamphlet, which was compiled by Simeon Jocelyn for the committee for the college. This one from the Beinecke collections belonged to John Warner Barber, a New Haven engraver, historian, and abolitionist, who was part of the group that supported the college. And as you can see, it says in his hand, "To be carefully preserved." We honor that by not only preserving this document, but by preserving and understanding the story it tells and what that story means for us as we look at New Haven's history and our community's history, and as we consider our own times. As I mentioned, that town meeting was packed, hot. The reports in the newspapers compiled by Jocelyn note that the meeting was addressed against the college by 4 people: Isaac Townsend, Ralph Ingersoll, Nathan Smith, and David Daggett, and that only Simeon Jocelyn spoke in favor. Notes that there were resolutions that passed by an almost unanimous vote, again, 700-4. Those resolutions were put forward by a committee that Dennis Kimberly, the mayor, had appointed, a committee that had 10 people, at least 6 of whom were Yale alums: Simeon Baldwin and William Bristol, Samuel Hitchcock, Ralph Ingersoll, Augustus Street, Isaac Townsend, and other luminaries of New Haven. It was basically a who's who of civic leadership, legal leadership, and political leadership. Townsend, for example, was the congressman. Many of the people had various offices. Baldwin had been mayor of New Haven. Hitchcock was a leading lawyer in town. Of the 4 who spoke against the college, David Daggett was at the time Associate Justice of Connecticut Superior Court. The next year, he would be Chief Justice of Connecticut Supreme Court. He was, along with Hitchcock, a founder of the Yale Law School, and he served on the Yale Corporation 3 times. The resolutions that were put forward and that were passed 700-4 are worthwhile reading. In the interest of time, I will not read them, but I encourage you to take a look at them and all the documents that are available about this time. There were 2 parts to the resolution. The first began, quote, "Resolved that inasmuch slavery does not exist in Connecticut," which actually, of course, was not true. Slavery was not widespread, but it did exist. But it goes on to say, while it's not in Connecticut, it is permitted in other states. And it basically says, as a matter of the town going on record, we will not question or interfere in other states. And in many ways, it is a resolution that excuses, and one could even say supports, slavery. It is one that is very much against abolition and in keeping with the sentiments of many people in the North, not only the South. The second reason was because of what the proponents of the resolutions, who were the opponents of the college, said that the Negro College would be an interference in the city and would hurt the city, that it would be, quote, destructive of the best interests in the city. It said in the resolutions, whereas in the opinion of this meeting, Yale College, the institutions for the education of females, and the other schools already existing in this city are important to the community and have general interests of science. And it goes on to say, the establishment of a college in the same place, i.e. New Haven, to educate the colored population is incompatible with the prosperity, if not the existence, of the present institutions of learning. The conversation went on for many, many weeks. Many of these things can be read in the pamphlet that Jocelyn put together that quote opponents and proponents, just to share a few of the words said against the college. One paper wrote, quote, "Here we have Yale College, among the highest ornaments of which are sons of Southern planters. We have several most respectable institutions for the instruction of young ladies, some of whom are from the South. There is no other town or city," this New Haven newspaper said, "that would suffer as much if such a college, a black college, were built." Another New Haven paper said, quote, "The establishment of a college here would at once give an eclat to our colored population that would ring through the land a summons that would hurry in the blacks as bees to a hive. It would communicate to the world the impression that New Haven was overrun with a vicious population, for throughout the United States, vice is uniformly associated with a large colored population." I will not go on, but I think you get, even in those few quotes, a sense of the extraordinary and extensive and deeply rooted anti-black racism expressed in the town meeting, in the conversations around the Black College. It was not just words that were said in that hot, crowded meeting. Those words, in addition to denying the college, unleashed in the streets of New Haven a riotous spirit. And in fact, you can see, this is the Liberator in October, an article about riots at New Haven, which notes the home of Arthur Tappan, the New York philanthropist and abolitionist who maintained a home in New Haven, had been attacked. It also notes that a house owned by a black person on Mount Pleasant in New Haven had been, quote, leveled to the ground. Later that month, in October 1831, there's a report of the same house in a Charleston, South Carolina newspaper, which underscores that what was happening in New Haven was being talked about all throughout the country, North and South. A Philadelphia newspaper notes about New Haven, quote, around this time, "On Thursday evening, a black man was knocked down in the streets, and on Friday evening, the house of a most respectable gentleman was assailed with shouts, indecent songs, and a shower of stones." There were many reports of such activity. As I noted, sometimes these were reported in Southern newspapers. It's probably not surprising, but it's certainly worth noting that New Haven's decision, 700-4, against a black college in 1831 was celebrated by many official voices in the slaveholding South. This is from a Georgia newspaper, September 24th, 1831. Quote, "We are glad to find that the good sense of the people of New Haven has induced them to act promptly and vigorously in opposition to the ill-judged and unjustifiable enthusiasm of misguided zealots." Richmond newspaper described what New Haven had done as an admirable lesson. And a newspaper in Natchez, Mississippi, carried a piece in October 1831 that reads, quote, "The attempt made by a convention in Philadelphia to establish a college at New Haven for the education of the blacks has been met by the citizens of the latter city in a spirit," and this is worth underscoring, "in a spirit that will be duly appreciated by the people of the South." The proposal for the neat black college had been widely publicized throughout the country. The decision in New Haven to oppose the college and prohibit it was widely covered throughout the country. It had real impact in riots that happened here, and it also had impacts over the years and in law. 2 years later, the New Haven experience was cited by opponents of Prudence Crandall and her Academy for Black Women in Canterbury, Connecticut, and both the 1831 college proposal and Prudence Crandall's school were followed by severe reaction at the state legislature, which in May 24th, 1833, passed what became known as, quote, the Black Law, that prevented the education of blacks from out of state in Connecticut. As many would know, Crandall was arrested and placed on trial. When it came to trial, the judge was Honorable David Daggett, who we encountered previously. And in his instructions to the jury, Daggett stated that, quote, Negroes were not citizens within the meaning of the term as used in the Constitution of the United States, denying the citizenship of Black people. His ruling would be cited later in the infamous Dred Scott case of 1857. So we can see that the actions in New Haven in 1831 had an impact locally, statewide, and nationally. The college, of course, did not happen. And perhaps that's why the story is not broadly known in our town, on our campus, in our state. There are a number of scholars, including in recent years, in the past decade, who've written about it and done extraordinary work to make sure that it's better known. We all, in keeping faith with those who came before, should do what we can to make it better known ourselves. We should, as John Warner Barber talked about, make sure that it is well preserved and shared. Barber lived a long life, and when he died in 1885, his obituary, which is pasted at the back of his line diary held by the New Haven Museum, says that he was a person who cared for justice and believed in the equality of human rights and opposed everything contrary to opposed everything that was against people's human rights. It says that as he grew older, this feeling increased. And the almost last line of his obituary in 1885 says this: on the 10th of September, 1831, he was one of the unpopular four who lifted up their right hands as a protest against the resolutions passed at a town meeting of the citizens of New Haven. The unpopular four, who joined with people like Peter Williams and Samuel Cornish, with Black leaders in New Haven, to try and create the nation's first Black college. One of the things people have asked is, where would this college have been? We don't know for sure, but in the research we've been doing in newspapers, and thanks to online resources, there are some notes in Vermont newspapers that read as follows, sort of reports from New Haven. And I'm quoting here from the Vermont Advocate. Quote, the extensive establishment at New Haven, formerly known as the Steamboat Hotel, and latterly as Dwight's Gymnasium or Gymnasium for Boys, has been purchased by a Mr. Jocelyn and is to be converted into a college for Blacks. You see on the 1830 map of Buckingham, the site of that New Haven Gymnasium, formerly the Steamboat Hotel, which had been a high school. It would make sense that this would be a place that Jocelyn and his allies would decide to locate a college in 1831. It is a site that many of us know in a way, in that it is underneath what is now the intersection of I-91 and I-95. Certainly the most traveled spot in the air, as it were, above on the highways in our region, perhaps in our state. Tens of thousands of people drive over that every day. You might be one of them. You might know the place. And it's a reminder that all around us are these stories. If we choose to look, if we choose to recover, if we choose to discover, if we choose to preserve, if we choose to share. And I encourage you to get to know this story, to share this story, to think about what it means, not only as an artifact of the past, but as something that we can consider from the past, in the present, for the future. And next time you're driving over the intersection of I-95 and I-91. Think about this college and join me in wondering what could have been. Thank you very much.
Well, Michael, thank you. That's a real blackboard. I love it. That was sobering, brilliant, and moving. And you have a lot of questions to field now, and numerous accolades and thank yous for this presentation. Let me also give a quick shout out though to Alvin and to Tubyez. Tubyez, I think your hands are on that handheld camera. That was frankly amazing. Who knew it was possible to make old 19th century documents like this so exciting and so moving with close-ups? And for anyone who knows New Haven at all, those maps put us right there. I mean, it's the most, significant real estate in New Haven, and we can actually visualize the places. And I love that drawing. Is it a lithograph of the New Haven town green? My goodness, anyone can recognize that. Brilliant work, Tubyez. God, I wish, I want to hire you to help me with my teaching. It's amazing. Let's start with the questions though, Mike. There's a lot of them here. We've had several questions from Nadir Salam. A number of his questions have been about the sources of the fear that New Havenites felt, that people at Yale felt, the 700 who voted on this. Was it memories of he asked, was it memories of the Haitian Revolution? Was it the Nat Turner Rebellion, which did happen in August of 1831? Might have been on their minds. But also, what other kinds of fears? What drove this vehement resistance? What would be your beginning estimation of that?
Yeah, and we'll put in the chat some links to really wonderful scholarship that Hilary Moss has done on this, and she's really perhaps the leading scholar of this story in contemporary times. James Brewer Stewart has done some really great work, and we'll put a link in the chat to those. So encourage people to seek out more on their own and consider the various opinions. Peter Hinks has done some work on New Haven in the decade before 1831, but applicable to this, and a number of other scholars. Stacey Close has recently published some things on this. It is a time of industrialization and dislocation of white artisans into more sort of industrial wage labor. The prospect of immigration is there a little bit, beginning to be there. So I think there's both white supremacy and anti-Black racism and economic and class things going on. I'm convinced in reading the various scholars. So I think there's a number of things. This is in a time when there is significant anti-Black racism, physical riots in Providence in September 1831. Obviously, the convention movement responds to riots in Cincinnati. So it's a time that in the North, in so-called free states, there's policing by legal and extra-legal means of Black people and Black bodies, and this in some ways is part of the context here. You see very much cited fears that a Black college would threaten the established Yale College and the other white literary and educational institutions for young women and schools, secondary schools. So that's there. The Nat Turner Rebellion is coincident. There's no doubt about this. It is mentioned some in conversations that you see in the weeks and months, and the conversation continues in the newspapers. And we can't obviously, we don't have recordings and transcripts of what people were talking about in their homes and on the green and in the taverns and those sorts of things. But the newspapers give us some proxy. But I don't think, I think that the vote would have happened anyway. The reading in the newspapers, the latent and blatant anti-Black racism in the predominant New Haven newspapers is very compelling, and I think is actually something that would be worth further review. I think we're all moved by the work that the Hartford Courant did with its history. There's some interesting history to be done in local newspapers. So I think there's a number of things going on in terms of white racism and various class issues that are at play, and encourage people to read Moss and Stewart and Hinks and others for deeper understanding of this and to come to your own conclusions.
Yeah, and I might just underscore that, Mike. The anti-abolition ferment in the country was really just kicking in 1831. It kicked in already a bit before, but Garrison's soon to be very famous newspaper, The Liberator, was first published back in January of 31.
New Haven was very much a center of colonization, so it was a place that was a back to Africa was the solution that white people proposed. And so a black college was a threat to colonization because it would show the strength and equality of black people and create leaders for staying in this country. And that was obviously one of the conscious reasons for the black leaders wanting to have a college and their white allies supporting them. So New Haven's supremacy of colonization sentiment, I think, is also part, and that's certainly, one sees that in the language of the resolutions, and you see it in the conversations that follow in the weeks.
I'm glad you said that, because we had a couple of questions about the connections to colonization. I think a key point is that abolitionism was really taking a radical turn around that time, for all the reasons you suggest. Russell Levitt asks if there's any connection between the people who worked for this college and the later Amistad case, which is about 8-9 years later.
There's various connections. Ralph Ingersoll, who's the congressman who lived at a house that still exists, that had just been built, the brick house at the corner of Elm and Temple Streets, across from the New Haven Free Public Library and the United Church, next to the Yale Visitor Center. So Ingersoll, big man in town, congressman, one of the people who speaks against the college and leads the opposition to the college, would go on to represent the Spanish crown in the Amistad affair. So there's a direct tie in that way, whereas Roger Sherman Baldwin, who was one of the people who supported the college, one of the quote unquote unpopular four, along with Jocelyn and John Warner Barber, would of course go on to lead the fight for the Mende and other people in the Amistad captives. So there are a number of different things going on there. It's a story that I think it's interesting for us to uplift the 1831 college at the beginning of the decade, and then the 1839-40 story of the Amistad. In the case of the Amistad, colonizationists could be very supportive of the liberation of the Amistad because it's, again, back to Africa, and it was on a sort of technicality that the decision was made. There are people who change their views over time. Leonard Bacon would be one who I would, and there's been Hugh Davis and others have done scholarship on this. Leonard Bacon was pastor of the Center Church at the time of this 1831 college, an ardent at the time colonizationist. I've read that it's believed that he probably did not vote at the meeting because he didn't own property at the time, so he may not have actually been eligible to vote. Bacon, it would take a while before Bacon would really come to what we might consider abolitionist views, but he really held out hope. So you do see in New Haven change in people's opinions over time. In 1831, Jocelyn and John Warner Barber and their allies were really at the forefront. And we have to center and uphold the free people like Bias Stanley, who, along with William Lamson, petitioned Connecticut for the right for black people to vote in 1814. So most of New Haven was dead set, white New Haven was dead set against the college. But you do see some righteous people who responded to and supported courageous free black leaders. And you do see some of the white people change over the course of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s until eventually the Civil War itself.
Catherine Overton wants you to know this is for her a stunning revelation, an expose about the history of her own birthplace. I think that stands for several other comments that I'm reading here. There have been a number of people writing in about the question of fear, and there's a whole theme developing here in the chat about how knowledge is fearful. You know, education is fearful. Education can take people places and so on.
In the convention 1831 proceedings is a phrase that we know very well, which is a timely and timeless phrase. It says simply, knowledge is power.
Exactly.
And,
right.
The free black people knew that. Their white allies understood it, and clearly their opponents understood it as well. Indeed.
Susan Klein wants a very practical question, but what gave the town the right to decide on allowing or not allowing this college? Is that because of the land?
That's a good question. And
why the town voting?
I'm not an expert in 19th century Connecticut law, state law, municipal law, land use law, and maybe if they had chosen, I have to say, they did not give up right away. Yeah. Jocelyn continues to write. There's a very long piece that's published, reprinted in this pamphlet, which I encourage everyone, and we've put, I think, in the chat a link to our digital copy of that, which everybody can take a look at and download and read at your leisure. So Jocelyn continued to advocate for the college, and people in Philadelphia and others in the convention movement continued, and they actually made a change that said the college could be in New Haven or elsewhere. So I'm not sure that it was strictly that the town meeting meant, absolutely it couldn't happen, but it was an overwhelming expression of sentiment that it would have been very hard to overcome, even if it, strictly speaking, did not have the power of law. And again, I'm not a legal scholar at all, including of those times, but I think that, it was the expression of sentiment was overpowering.
Yeah, it was a town decision, not a decision made by Yale, and yet a lot of Yale people were involved in this.
I think one of the things, that it is a Yale story and it is a New Haven story, and it is a Yale story and a New Haven story and a Connecticut story. Much of the leadership was educated from Yale and was of Yale. It was the college, the first college, obviously, not only in New Haven, but in Connecticut, a leading place. And as I mentioned, 50% of the students, even at this time, were from Connecticut. I think all of Yale's trustees were from Connecticut at the time. So it's not quite the 21st century kind of landscape that we know. And this, of course, is something that in the work we're doing, and we're blessed to have such strong community partners in the work we're doing in the Yale and Slavery, members of the Yale and Slavery Working Group, and colleagues around town who are doing research. Because in so many ways, this Yale and slavery story is a New Haven and slavery and its aftermath story, and a Connecticut and slavery and its aftermath story. And that, I hope, is one of the things that we can have people thinking about, similarities, differences, and those contexts and how they speak to us today.
Well, here's another Yale question from David Coslow. Benjamin Silliman, which the college's name, was teaching here at the time. Do we have evidence that he was involved in this?
It's an interesting, and sort of along with colleagues here, and I hope that this will spur others to be interested in it. I've done some work in looking at some papers. So Harry Croswell was the pastor of Trinity Church at the time. His papers and diary are at the Yale Divinity School Special Collections. He was out of town in Boston on a long scheduled Episcopal thing. So we know he was not here and didn't vote against it. There's a whole bunch of research that scholars have done on Croswell and race that's very interesting and for another time. I've begun to look at papers to try and find out. That's partly why I went to look at Barber's diary in the New Haven Museum, which is an extraordinary document. And Barber underlines that he was there, and as we know from his obituary, he was one of the righteous four who raised their hands. Daggett, we know where he was, and I've begun to look at some others, but Noah Webster was a New Havener. What was he doing? It's said
Yeah.
in some reports that 100 people may have been present and not voting. So uh, uh, who knows, but it's worth looking at Silliman and other papers. Hillhouse, both the elder James Hillhouse died in 1832, and his son also James Hillhouse. So I think there's work that those of us who are interested can do in the personal papers and diaries of people who were in New Haven at the time.
There are a number of people asking if there were connections here between elite New Haveners and people at Yale with West Indian planters. In other words, have we turned up any evidence about connections around this event to Yale's many financial and economic connections to the West Indies, or is that just tangential to this?
I don't think it's tangential. You know, as was noted, the ties with West Indies were one of the things that the college proponents thought would be in its favor as Jamaica and other places were emancipated, and as free black people in Jamaica and other places in the West Indies, in the Anglophone West Indies. So they saw it, the proponents of the college saw it a reason for it. No doubt opponents probably felt that it would be problematic. They clearly thought it would be problematic with economic ties with the American South and with slave states. So surely there are resonances and echoes and ties. Families had various ties. Samuel Hitchcock, who was mentioned, who I mentioned, his family crest included a crocodile, which one sees on the coat of arms of the Yale Law School, because they brought the first Hitchcocks brought a crocodile with them from the Bahamas, where they came. And you see not only enslaved and free black people coming from the West Indies to places like New Haven, you do see white people who are coming to live here, including into the early 19th century. I think it's an area worth pursuing, and we've heard other people raise the questions of the ties with the West Indies, not just purely commercial ties, but familial and other personal ties. So I think that's a good area for continued scholarship and digging in the archives at Yale and the New Haven Museum and elsewhere.
There are various questions about other black colleges. One person has asked, where was the first black college? To my knowledge, that's probably Wilberforce in Ohio, although you might get a fight and a debate over that. There was also an attempt at creating an industrial college in Ohio in the 1850s by the Black Convention movement, the same source that would have created this more than 2 decades earlier. Frederick Douglass worked on that one. There was a question in here too asking if Douglass was involved in this at all. Well, at this point in time, 1831, Douglass was a 13-year-old slave back in either Baltimore or the Eastern Shore. He later became fully knowledgeable about this event as well as the Amistad, but Douglass didn't escape till 1838. At any rate, and there are questions here about Howard University. Was there similar resistance to that when it was created in 1866? I don't know, Mike, if you want to comment on that. We have
again, you know,
Yale's connections to other HBCUs, but that didn't happen to the 20th century. So.
You know, the role of the library is to help provide routes to answers. So I think my answer can always be, go look for yourself.
Right.
And we can help you find the ways. There's obviously some terrific scholarship done over the decades and centuries on black colleges and higher education. There's a new book just out about HBCUs, obviously the documentary work that happily got a lot of acclaim and viewership. So I would encourage people to seek out those sources, the sort of secondary sources, and there's lots of good primary sources. I think, you know, one will find Lincoln and Cheney grads might have conversations amongst themselves over who was first. Cheney certainly.
A number of people have mentioned Cheney in Pennsylvania. Right.
Cheney and the Institute for Colored Youth makes, I think, a strong claim to that. But again, encourage people to seek out that. There had been a few places that enrolled black students, including Bowdoin, around this time. And this was talked about and the lack of ability. Many of the opponents to this college said they would be happy if it existed, if it was in Cornwall, Connecticut, or somewhere where they didn't have to see it and where it wasn't a threat, and there wouldn't be black people walking on the streets with them. And so part of the reaction here was it being in an urban and populated environment, whether it would have been a different thing, but I mean, one can see again the anti-black racism and those kinds of the sort of soft, latent and blatant racism that one sees in those kind of conversations.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have talked about this many times, but the more we do research on this, it is quite striking how this is a story deep in the 19th century, but also with so many modern echoes, to say the least, of conditions and problems that we face today. There are a number of people asking about whether our project is researching these connections of Southerners to Yale. That is, the sons of planters. You said that in 1831, about 10% of the student body were from the South. We know that generally was from the upper South, but these were young men from planter families. You want to comment on that at all? Because we do have
we are doing that work. Others have done it, everything that the Yale Slavery Group is doing is building on work that has gone before. So there's been good work done in academic institutions and by citizen scholars on this question. And around this immediate time, one of the graduates of the Yale College class of 1831 would go on to be governor of South Carolina. So you see the ties at the time, and that person would have been present in New Haven around the town meeting, because again, commencement happened in September 1831. There's been recent scholarship uplifting the story of a white Kentuckian, Cassius Clay, who was a student at Yale at the time and heard Garrison speak when he came to New Haven in this time, and that fed some of his own thinking and planning and helped plant seeds that would become what we know as Berea College. So there's lots of different kinds of ties, and then there are New Haveners who go to the South for economic reasons and other reasons. There's graduates who leave, who are Northerners, who go to teach in the South. So there's lots of different kinds of ties. And this story can be a good entry point for some of those broader themes. And I think that's one of the powers of the story of the 1831 college, and why it's good to uplift it, is it can get us thinking, just as these questions and things that we're seeing in the chat, lots of different aspects. And so I hope, just as the story of the Amistad has been one that has led people to go look at other things and to follow branches and the streams that came before it, this also can be a story like that. And I'm very excited. I want to shout out students and faculty at New Haven's Metropolitan Business Academy who've been doing work. They've done some great things in getting to know about the story for themselves and publishing about it in podcasts and other things. And I think it shows, just as the robustness of the conversation and questions, that this one story can be something that people can take and use to get to know more deeply the story itself, but to know the broader context of what was happening before and what was happening after.
We have a Yale alum, Tim Weiskell, who is remembering, he didn't give the year here, but it's quite a ways back when he sat in classes with the historian Roland Osterweiss, who actually taught about this event in his classes. So that's actually wonderful to hear, because there were a number of Yale historians over the years who actually helped invent the field of the study of slavery.
Yeah, Professor Osterweiss's 3 Centuries of New Haven is a book that is worth revisiting. Yeah. And encourage people, and I think it's in chapters 25 and 26, if I'm remembering. But yeah, it makes the point that this story, you and I have talked about looking at Barber's diary in the New Haven Museum and seeing that the last line in his obituary, 50 years after the fact, is about the story, shows that it was in memory and powerful even 50 years later. And absolutely, Mary Mitchell, one of the great unsung two little sung, I won't say she's unsung, but two little sung historians of New Haven who did extraordinary work in the 20th century, wrote about this in various different places. And one sees in the papers of the then New Haven Colony Historical Society. So it is, and it's wonderful to have Professor Osterweiss, who was a great centurion of Yale and of New Haven and its history, his name uplifted in this conversation.
You know, 30 years later from this event you've just revealed, Americans were at war by September of 1861 over this problem of slavery. In 1831, the abolition movement was making a radical turn. We see here that great change is to come in decades ahead, many decades ahead. But history is also always full of resistance to great change, perhaps inevitably. I just want to say, Mike, I guess this is less a question than a comment, but I'd like you to comment too. Back to your kind of concluding thought of how this is very much a local event. And in all history and memory begins with the local, and yet it had enormous consequences. It had enormous implications across American culture. And, you know, hard as it is to get to, it has a deep and abiding memory that we are now trying to reconstruct and actually contribute to. You know, and one of the themes or central threads, which you've helped me understand in our project of trying to write Yale's history with this, is to try to comprehend in its many different stages the way Yale University forged its own memory and its own memory of its surroundings and its own memory even of its nation that it lived within. And this is clearly a classic example of that. Love to hear your thoughts on that as we, I think, have to conclude here.
Yeah, and so I think that is a good point. And a couple of thoughts. The main one would be, I think, history, stories like this remind us that things are not inevitable. There are forces, but these are not forces of nature. Building a college, maintaining or fighting against a system of human enslavement. These are things that we have choices about. People have choices about, things that can be done. The majority of white New Haven, white Yale in 1831, the vast majority either sat silently or colluded, unfortunately, with what we can all recognize was a terrible decision. A few white people were courageous, and they were supporting extraordinary work by free black people. And so I think the story gives us an opportunity to reckon with the fact that these are human choices, and to think about the human choices that were made and what the consequences were. To take fortitude from the courageous people and to try and learn and not repeat the mistakes of those who fought against this college. And to think about what we can do in our time to help promote educational opportunity for everyone. So I think that's one thing. And then, as you noted, what do we remember and what do we choose to forget? And that is the work that we're doing in the Yale and Slavery Project, that folks in the Amistad Committee and the Connecticut Freedom Trail and others have been doing for a long time, so that we don't forget and hopefully we do better. Probably aren't going to reach perfection, but we can be better if we have a better understanding of the far past and the near past. And so with that, let me offer thanks to you, David, and thanks again to Alvin and to Tubyez. Great thanks to the hundreds who've joined us today. Next week, my colleague Nancy Kuhl will join us to talk about a show that is viewable online and is viewable to those who are able to access campus at the moment. And 2 weeks from now, we will be joined by our dear friend Regina Mason, the great-great-great-granddaughter of William Grimes, and she will be talking about her ancestor and his work I encourage everyone, it's another story that has been, thanks to Regina and others, recovered, discovered, and promoted, and is becoming more broadly known. But I encourage everyone to join us for that. We'll have a number of other Mondays at Beinecke episodes in October, focused on the Yale Slavery Working Group. And as David noted, on October 28th to 30th, a really epic conference, and more to come on Thursday. So I encourage everyone to go to the event that GLC is putting on. With that, thank you again, David. Thank you so much. See you all very soon.